Not even 30 mechanics could start this truck. The words were a declaration of absolute surrender, spoken by Richard Sterling, the 60-year-old CEO of Sterling Logistics, one of the largest and most successful trucking companies in the American Midwest. He was standing in the pristine, brightly lit central service bay of his company's massive headquarters in Columbus, Ohio, a facility so large it could service 20 semi-trucks simultaneously. His audience was a group of visiting investors and industry journalists, and he was gesturing dramatically at a truck that had become a source of both immense frustration and corporate embarrassment, a 2021 Freightliner Cascadia, the flagship model of his fleet, equipped with a state-of-the-art Detroit DD15 engine. This truck, with only 90,000 miles on the odometer, had been sitting dead in this bay for 3 full months. It wouldn't start. It would crank, the engine turning over with a healthy rhythm, but it would never fire. It was a $180,000 piece of modern engineering that had been defeated by a problem no one could find. But before we get into the mystery of the silent Cascadia, I have to ask, where in the world are you watching this story from? Are you in the United States, perhaps somewhere in Europe or another part of the globe? Drop a comment below and let me know. And tell me this, have you ever encountered a problem so stubborn that it stumped every expert, only to be solved by someone who saw things from a completely different angle? Let's build a community that celebrates that kind of thinking. Richard Sterling was using the truck as a prop for a speech about the challenges of modern trucking. This truck, he announced to his audience, represents the double-edged sword of technology. It's more fuel-efficient, safer, and more powerful than anything we had 10 years ago. But it's also a million lines of code on wheels, and when that code goes wrong, it can be impossible to fix. We've had our own master technicians, the Freightliner dealership's top guys, and even a team of engineers flown in from Detroit look at this truck. Over 30 mechanics in total. They've replaced the engine computer, the entire fuel system, half the wiring harness. We've spent over $40,000 in parts and diagnostic time, and it's still dead. It's a ghost in the machine. The investors looked concerned. The journalists took notes. It was a powerful, if unintentional, indictment of the very trucks Sterling's company relied on. What Richard Sterling didn't see was the woman standing quietly at the edge of the service bay, observing the scene. Her name was Clara Mitchell, 42 years old, owner of a small, highly specialized mobile diagnostic service based out of a rural town in Pennsylvania. She wasn't a typical mechanic. She was a former software engineer who had spent 15 years designing control systems for industrial machinery before leaving the corporate world to combine her love for programming with her passion for heavy-duty engines. Her business, Mitchell Diagnostic Solutions, was the last resort for trucking companies, dealerships, and even manufacturers when they faced complex electronic issues that defied conventional mechanical diagnosis. Richard Sterling's fleet manager, at his wit's end, had heard of Clara through a contact at Detroit Diesel and had called her a week ago, offering her an exorbitant fee to come to Ohio and take one last look at the cursed Cascadia before they gave up and sent it back to the factory. After the investors and journalists had moved on, Richard Sterling walked over to Clara, his expression a mixture of skepticism and desperation. "So, you're the ghost hunter they sent from Pennsylvania. I hope you didn't waste a trip. As you just heard, 30 of the best mechanics in the country couldn't fix this thing. What makes you think you can?" His tone wasn't just skeptical, it was condescending. He was a man who believed in established hierarchies, and in his world, engineers from Detroit were at the top, and a lone woman from a small town in Pennsylvania was, by definition, at the bottom. Clara met his gaze, her expression unreadable, because the other 29 mechanics were probably all looking for a mechanical problem. "I'm not a mechanic, Mr. Sterling. I'm a systems engineer. I don't look for broken parts. I look for broken logic. May I begin?" Sterling, taken aback by her confidence, simply nodded and, gestured to the truck. He and his fleet manager, a man named Tom, stood back, expecting to watch another frustrating and ultimately fruitless diagnostic attempt. Clara didn't open a toolbox. She didn't pop the hood. Her first move was to plug her laptop, a ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook, into the truck's diagnostic port. For the next 30 minutes, she didn't move from the driver's seat. She wasn't just reading fault codes. The previous mechanics had done that dozens of times. She was doing Something far deeper. She was accessing the truck's controller area network, CAN bus, the complex nervous system that allows all the different computers on the truck, the engine controller, MCM, the transmission controller, TCM, the chassis controller, SAM, the brake controller, ABS, to communicate with each other. She was capturing raw data packets, thousands of them per second, as she cranked the engine. She was looking at the digital conversation happening inside the machine. Tom, the fleet manager, watched her screen over her shoulder, completely bewildered by the lines of hexadecimal code scrolling past. "What are you even looking at?" he asked. Clara didn't look up. "I'm listening to the truck argue with itself." After capturing several minutes of data, Clara stopped. She opened a proprietary software she had written herself, which translated the raw CAN bus data into a visual, color-coded flowchart of the truck's startup sequence. And there, on the screen, was the problem, or rather the symptom of the problem. Her software showed a clear, logical sequence: ignition on, all modules report ready, engine cranks, RPM signal is good, fuel pressure builds correctly. Then, exactly 1.5 seconds after cranking begins, a cease injection command is issued by the chassis controller, the SAM module. The engine computer, MCM, then dutifully cuts fuel to the injectors, and the engine refuses to start, every single time. The previous mechanics had seen that the injectors weren't firing, which is why they had focused on the fuel system and the engine computer. They were looking in the wrong place. The command to stop was coming from a completely different computer. "The problem isn't your engine," Clara announced, turning her laptop to show Sterling and Tom. "The problem is that your chassis computer is telling your engine computer to shut down. The question is, why?" This was a revelation. For 3 months, everyone had been treating this as an engine problem. Clara had just proven in 30 minutes that it was a chassis problem. She dove deeper into the data, looking for the signal that was triggering the SAM module to issue the shutdown command. The SAM module is responsible for monitoring hundreds of inputs: lights, switches, sensors, everything on the truck's body and frame. Any one of those could be the culprit. She began to systematically unplug different systems digitally, using her software to send commands that mimicked disconnecting them, trying to isolate the trigger. She disabled the lighting circuits, the HVAC controls, the anti-theft system. The truck still wouldn't start. The shutdown command was still being issued. She was running out of systems to check. The problem was clearly related to a safety interlock, a signal that was so critical, the truck was programmed to refuse to start if the signal was incorrect. But what could it be? She pulled up the master schematic for the Freightliner Cascadia's entire electronic system, a document so complex it looked like the blueprint for a city. She began tracing every single input that the SAM module monitors as part of its pre-start safety check. There were hundreds, but Clara's experience wasn't in mechanics, it was in system logic. She knew that programmers prioritize. The most critical safety checks happen first. She started looking for the most obscure, most unlikely, but most critical inputs. And then she saw it. Tucked away in a sub-menu of the chassis module's parameters was a line item for fifth wheel latch sensor. On a semi-truck, the fifth wheel is the heavy, horseshoe-shaped coupling on the back of the truck that connects to the trailer. For safety, modern trucks have a sensor that confirms the trailer's kingpin is securely latched. According to the truck's programming logic, if the truck's anti-theft system was armed and the fifth wheel sensor detected that the trailer had been unlatched without the driver first unlocking the system from inside the cab, it would trigger a tamper alert. This was designed to prevent someone from stealing a trailer. In most cases, this would just set off an alarm. But on this specific software version for Sterling's fleet, which had an enhanced security package, the logic was more extreme. A tamper alert would put the truck into a hard lockdown and prevent the engine from starting until the system was reset by a dealer. Clara had a theory. What if the sensor was faulty? What if it was sending a permanent unlatched signal to the SAM module? And what if, 3 months ago, the driver had armed the security system before this fault occurred? The truck would now be in a permanent, unbreakable lockdown loop. The SAM module would see the unlatched signal, interpret it as a tamper, and command the engine to shut down no matter what. The dealership's tools could reset the alarm, but they couldn't fix the underlying false signal. So the moment they tried to start it again, the lockdown would re-engage. It was a perfect logic trap. It was a detail so small, so obscure, so unrelated to the engine that 30 mechanics had completely missed it. Richard Sterling and his fleet manager Tom watched as Clara, her face illuminated by the glow of her laptop, navigated through screen after screen of complex data. They didn't understand what she was doing, but they recognized the intense focus of a true expert at work. "It's the fifth wheel," Clara said finally, looking up from her screen. "I'm almost certain of it. The truck thinks the trailer is being stolen, so it's refusing to start." Sterling looked at her, then at the back of the truck, which had no trailer attached, and then back at her. The idea seemed absurd. The fifth wheel. What does that have to do with the engine? We've had this truck for years. It's never done that before. "It's not the fifth wheel itself," Clara clarified, her voice patient. "It's the sensor that monitors the latch. My data shows the SAM module is receiving a constant unlatched signal from that sensor. 3 months ago, your driver probably set the alarm. The truck went into a tamper lockdown because it saw an unlatched signal without a corresponding unlock command from the cab. Since the sensor is permanently faulty, the lockdown never clears. Every time you try to start it, the logic loop repeats. SAM sees unlatched, assumes theft, and tells the engine computer to cease injection. It's a software problem triggered by a hardware failure." Sterling was a successful CEO because he was smart enough to recognize expertise, even when it challenged his own assumptions. The logic of Clara's explanation was elegant and terrifyingly plausible. It explained why replacing the entire fuel system and the engine computer had done nothing. Those components were working perfectly. They were simply being told not to work by another system. "So if you're right," Sterling asked, "how do we fix it? Replace the sensor?" "Eventually, yes. The sensor itself is a cheap part, but just replacing it won't be enough. We have to break the logic loop in the computer. The dealership's tools can't do that because they're designed not to override critical safety features. But I'm not using their tools." Clara's fingers flew across her keyboard. She was writing a small piece of code, a custom script designed to be injected directly into the truck's SAM module via the diagnostic port. The script was simple, but brilliant. It would create a virtual jumper, telling the SAM module to completely ignore the input from the fifth wheel latch sensor and instead read a permanent, latched and secure signal. She was digitally hot-wiring the truck's brain. "This is risky," she warned, looking at Sterling. "If I make a mistake, I could permanently damage the SAM module. It's a $3,000 part." Sterling didn't hesitate. They had already spent over $40,000 on failed repairs. Another $3,000 was nothing. "Do it," he said. Clara took a deep breath, reviewed her code one last time and executed the script. The laptop screen flickered as the code was uploaded. A progress bar appeared, then a message. "Patch applied successfully. Module rebooting." All the lights on the truck's dashboard blinked off, then back on, as the chassis computer restarted with its new instructions. The entire process had taken less than 5 minutes. "Now," Clara said, her voice betraying a hint of triumphant excitement, "let's see if our ghost has left the machine." She got out of the driver's seat and gestured for Richard Sterling to take her place. "You should be the one to start it." Sterling, looking nervous and hopeful for the first time in months, climbed into the cab of his dead truck. He put the key in the ignition and turned it. The familiar sequence of beeps and chimes filled the cab. The gauges swept. He paused, took a breath, and turned the key to the start position. The engine cranked. 1 revolution. 2 revolutions. And then, with a deep, powerful roar that echoed through the massive service facility, the Detroit DD-15 engine fired to life. It didn't sputter. It didn't hesitate. It ignited instantly and settled into a perfectly smooth, powerful idle. The sound of 500 horsepower and 1,850 foot-pounds of torque finally unleashed. It was running. Actually, running. The half-dozen mechanics from Sterling's own team who had gathered to watch the ghost hunter work stood in stunned silence. Tom, the fleet manager, let out a long, slow whistle of pure disbelief. Richard Sterling sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, his hands on the steering wheel, just listening to the sound of the engine he had been told was unfixable. He looked out the windshield at Clara, who was standing with her arms crossed, a small, knowing smile on her face. He shut off the engine, then started it again. It fired instantly. He did it a third time. Perfect. He finally climbed out of the cab, his face a mask of astonishment and humility. He walked over to Clara, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Mitchell. I was condescending and dismissive. You just did something that 30 of the best mechanics I could find, including my own team and a crew of factory engineers, couldn't do in 3 months. You did it in under an hour. How?" "You were all looking at the engine," Clara explained, her tone now that of a teacher. "You were looking for a problem with the heart, but the heart was fine. The problem was in the nervous system. The truck's brain was getting a bad signal from one of its nerves, the fifth wheel sensor, and that signal was triggering a logical response. Lockdown. You were trying to fix the heart, but the brain was the one telling it not to beat. I just found the bad nerve and told the brain to ignore it." She then walked him through the data on her laptop, showing him the CAN bus traffic, the shutdown command from the SAM module, and the logic that led her to the faulty sensor. For Sterling, a man who dealt in logistics and systems, it was a profound lesson. He hadn't just been wrong about the truck, he had been wrong about how to approach a problem. He turned to his fleet manager. "Tom, get Ms. Mitchell a blank check from accounting." He turned back to Clara. "I don't even know what to pay you. Your original quote is an insult to what you just accomplished. You saved me from scrapping a $180,000 truck. You solved a problem that was costing me thousands of dollars a day in lost revenue. And you taught me a lesson I desperately needed to learn. Fill that check out for whatever you think is fair, and consider it a retainer. I want you to be the exclusive diagnostic consultant for my entire fleet of over 500 trucks." Clara was taken aback. This single job, which she had taken mostly out of professional curiosity, was about to transform her small, one-woman business. "Mr. Sterling, that's incredibly generous, but my fee is my fee." "What?" "I'd prefer, instead of a blank check, is an opportunity. I want you to fund a training program. Send me 2 of your best young mechanics for a month. I'll teach them my methods, how to read CAN bus data, how to think about system logic, how to diagnose problems at the source. That knowledge will be worth more to your company in the long run than any single check you could write me." Richard Sterling was floored. He had offered her a fortune, and she had countered by offering him something far more valuable: knowledge and a long-term solution. He had expected a transaction. She was proposing a partnership. "Deal," he said, shaking her hand with genuine respect. "And the first 2 students in your program will be me and Tom. If we're going to run this company, we need to understand how these machines actually think." The story of what happened that day spread like a legend through Sterling Logistics. The cursed Cascadia became known as Clara's truck. It went back into service the next day, after the faulty $80 fifth wheel sensor was replaced, and ran without a single issue for the next 500,000 miles. It served as a constant reminder to every mechanic in the company that the most obvious solution is not always the right one, and that sometimes the problem isn't the engine at all, but a single broken line of communication. The training program was a massive success. Richard and Tom spent a month at Clara's home in Pennsylvania, learning the fundamentals of electronics. Diagnostics. They were humbled by the complexity and fascinated by the logic. They returned to Ohio and fundamentally changed how Sterling Logistics approached maintenance. They invested in high-end diagnostic tools for their shops. They implemented a new tiered training system with a focus on electronic and systems-level thinking. Clara, as their consultant, helped them design the curriculum. The result was a dramatic decrease in vehicle downtime, a significant reduction in unnecessary parts, replacement, and millions of dollars saved annually. The company's mechanics, once frustrated by problems they couldn't solve, became some of the most skilled diagnostic technicians in the industry, sought after by other companies. The partnership between Clara Mitchell and Sterling Logistics became a case study in the trucking industry. Other large fleets, hearing about the dramatic improvements in Sterling's maintenance program, began to contact Clara, seeking similar consulting arrangements. Her one-woman mobile operation quickly became a highly sought-after multi-million-dollar diagnostic consulting firm. She hired a small team of engineers, not mechanics, but other systems thinkers like herself, to help her manage the workload. They didn't turn wrenches, they solved puzzles. They flew around the country from one fleet headquarters to another, armed with laptops and oscilloscopes, solving the impossible problems that left entire fleets of expensive modern trucks sitting idle. Clara became one of the most influential figures in the heavy-duty vehicle industry, not by building a company in the traditional sense, but by building a new way of thinking. She published several papers on advanced diagnostic strategies, and her methods were eventually incorporated into the official training programs for major manufacturers like Detroit Diesel and Cummins. The obscure fifth-wheel latch sensor on the Cascadia became a famous example in her training modules, a symbol of how a tiny, overlooked detail could bring a massive, complex system to a grinding halt. Richard Sterling, for his part, was a changed man. The experience had shattered his arrogant certainty and replaced it with a deep, abiding respect for true expertise wherever it might be found. He became a vocal advocate for technical education and a major financial backer of programs designed to bring more women and diverse talent into the skilled trades. He often told the story of the cursed Cascadia at industry conferences, not as a story of his company's failure, but as a story of his own personal and professional transformation. He always ended the story the same way. For 3 months, I had the best equipped shops and the most experienced mechanics in the world throwing parts at a problem they didn't understand. We were lost. Then, one person came, and instead of looking at the truck, she listened to it. She taught me that in the modern age, the most valuable skill isn't knowing how to fix things, but knowing how to understand them. The impact on the mechanics at Sterling Logistics was profound. They had been demoralized, beaten by a problem that made them question their own skills. Clara's success and her willingness to teach them, rather than belittle them, restored their confidence. They embraced the new training with enthusiasm. The 2 mechanics who had been sent to shadow Clara came back and became mentors themselves, leading internal training sessions, sharing the knowledge. A culture of collaborative problem-solving replaced the old culture of guesswork and parts swapping. The shop floor, once a place of frustration, became a hub of learning and innovation. The mechanics started competing to see who could solve the most complex diagnostic puzzles, posting their successes on a shared problem-solved board in the break room. Clara never lost her love for hands-on work. Despite the success of her consulting firm, she still kept her mobile service truck and occasionally took on barn-find projects, just for the love of the challenge. The story of the Cascadia gave her a certain legendary status. Sometimes, a fleet manager would call with a strange problem, and halfway through the description, Clara would interrupt with a few pointed questions and then say, "Check the CAN bus signal from the trailer ABS module. It's probably sending a corrupt data packet that's confusing the transmission controller." The silence on the other end of the phone, followed by a stunned, "How did you know that?" was something she never got tired of. The 2021 Freightliner Cascadia, at the heart of the story, continued its life as a working truck in the Sterling fleet, but it was always treated with a certain reverence. The drivers assigned to it knew its story. It became a symbol within the company of their new philosophy: listen before you leap. The story served as a powerful lesson for an entire industry, grappling with the transition from purely mechanical machines to complex rolling computer networks. It highlighted the critical need for a new kind of technician, one who was as comfortable with a laptop and an oscilloscope as they were with a wrench and a torque multiplier. Clara Mitchell wasn't just a great mechanic. She was the prototype for the mechanic of the future. Her legacy wasn't in the single truck she fixed, but in the thousands of mechanics she inspired to think differently. Her single detail, the obscure fifth-wheel sensor, had become a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in service bays across the country, a reminder that in the face of overwhelming complexity, the solution is sometimes elegantly, maddeningly, and beautifully simple. It's not about the 30 mechanics who fail. It's about the one who finally thinks to look in the right place. So as we close this story, I ask you one final time, where in the world are you watching from? What is the unfixable problem in your life or work, the one that has stumped? All the experts? Let me know in the comments below, because Clara Mitchell proved that the most complex problems don't always require complex solutions. They require a different perspective. They require someone to stop looking at the symptoms and start listening to the system. Let's build a community that celebrates that kind of thinking, the kind that can silence a millionaire and awaken a giant with a single brilliant detail. Together.